we have, I would like to invite the second panelist, Nicolas Al-Jeloo. He's independent scholar, and he will present for us a paper, August 7 from 1924 to 2014, Repeated Histories of Assyrian Expulsion. And I will maybe just start his presentation. So this is the mode of full screen, please.
Okay, thank you, Anna, for the introduction. Now, I've changed the title a little bit, and I've extended it by a further decade, so I'm starting it actually from 1914. Okay? Now, throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, the Middle East's indigenous Christian Assyrian minority has faced a number of forced migrations linked to wars, nationalism, and religious extremism. In all of these cases, they have emerged as the scapegoats and biggest losers, gradually diminishing their demographic strength and critical mass in many geographical areas where they once dominated. Significantly, however, and within a 100-year period spanning both centuries, August 7, or the first 2 weeks of August, can be found as prominent dates common to several cases of Assyrian expulsion, in a similar way to how the 9th of Av has emerged as a day of commemoration in Judaism. Now, this begins with the start of the Assyrian genocide in 1914 and ends with the ISIS invasion of the Nineveh Plain and forced displacement of 150,000 Assyrian Christians in 2014. Now, all of these cataclysmic events occurred around the same date. So there are other dates in between, there are other events in between that have occurred, but these are the main ones that happened around the beginning of August. And this increases the potency of the 7th of August as a day of Assyrian national commemoration, mourning, and remembrance. Moreover, they have either taken place as part of greater acts of genocide against the Assyrian people, or resulted in the cultural genocide of their heritage due to destruction and depopulation. This paper will briefly describe such cases of forced migration of Assyrians, including what motivated them and the processes in which they were carried out specifically. Now, August shows up as a significant month during the genocide perpetrated by the Ottoman government and its allies against the Syrians under the cover of the First World War. On the 3rd of August 1914, after the outbreak of the war, the Assyrian Patriarch met with the governor of Van province, and a number of promises were made to keep his adherents loyal. However, this was conditional upon the Assyrians' neutrality and abstaining from forming any alliances with Russia. At the same time, soldiers were being conscripted from the Assyrians around Van, whose homes were being plundered in the name of collecting aid for the army. Many Assyrians resisted conscription and fled to Persia, today's Iran. Ottoman authorities suspected the entire nation as ripe for provocation by the Russians. From August onward, they began displacing those in the frontier districts bordering Iran who fled from violent, preemptive Ottoman military attacks. Assyrians in 9 border villages were forced to flee to Persia, and their villages were burned after they refused to join the Ottoman army. Many were captured, tortured, and brutally slain. Moreover, the Ottoman military was reported to be arming Kurdish tribesmen while confiscating any weapons from any Assyrians which they were able to. The Assyrians' loyalty during a planned attack on Russian-controlled Persia led to further plans for the community's full-scale deportation to Muslim-dominated areas of Central Asia Minor, in order to bring about their assimilation and the destruction of their culture, language, and traditional way of life. This order was never carried out. However, in January 1915, the Assyrians became fully aware of the Ottoman government's complicity in atrocities being committed against their brethren in the frontier districts, as well as across the border in Persia. And in April, new massacres of Christians began to take place around Van. An assembly between the Patriarch and Assyrian lay leaders resulted in an order for a general mobilization against the apparent threat. And in June, the Patriarch set out to request the Russian military's aid and protection. Now, the Ottomans took this as a declaration of war, and the governors of Mosul and Van immediately advanced their forces along with Kurdish irregulars to attack the Assyrians of the Hakkari highlands. The result was disastrous. Between July and October, waves of Assyrian refugees, totaling some 50,000 survivors, fought their way through to Persia. So between July and October, mostly actually in August. Now there, the Assyrian refugees managed to benefit from Russian protection, as well as the fellowship and support of tens of thousands of their brethren who were native Persian subjects. After the Bolshevik Revolution in November 1917, however, Russian forces withdrew, and the Assyrians were left to defend themselves against Ottoman attacks with whatever weapons and ammunition the Russians had left behind. Now, in June 1918, Ottoman troops began to invade Persia in cooperation with Kurdish tribesmen, and their assaults intensified as they attempted to weaken the Assyrians into surrendering their positions. The Assyrians were surrounded, and the resulting defensive battles depleted their ammunition stocks. In late July, the commander-in-chief of the Assyrian forces departed with some 1,500 of his cavalrymen to retrieve British-supplied weapons and ammunition, some 160 kilometers to the southeast, way beyond enemy lines. The Ottomans seized the opportunity and attacked in force. The front collapsed on July the 30th, so the Assyrians began a retreat south through hostile territory toward British lines. More than 80,000 Assyrians and Armenians fled for safety, and the convoy was attacked from all sides. On 2 occasions, their retreat was cut off, and thousands were captured and massacred. It took 6 weeks until the last of the refugees reached their destination. The refugee column, which actually my grandfather was a part of, is described as having been up to 65 kilometers long and more than 1.5 kilometers wide, and an estimated 25,000 Assyrians perished on this march. Fewer than 50,000 survivors reached safety at Hamadan, and in December, the majority of them were transported to a camp prepared by the British at Baquba in Iraq, where most were eventually resettled. The fears of the refugees were not unfounded. Up to 17,000 Assyrians who did not manage to escape remained at Urmia when it was reoccupied by Ottoman forces. After the mass wave of killing during the first week of Ottoman occupation had subsided, it was found that only 860 people had survived. Among those killed were the local Chaldean Catholic Archbishop and the Vatican's Apostolic Delegate. So, the refugees stayed at the camp in Baquba until roughly May 1921, when some 8,000 of these Assyrians decided to return to their villages in Hakkari. Because the Allies had won the war, they assumed that the region had been incorporated into British-controlled Iraq and was no longer under Turkish rule. At negotiations between Turkey and Britain over Mosul in May and June 1924, the British representative proposed that Hakkari be returned to the Assyrians and incorporated into Iraq, whereas the Turkish representative rejected the entire plan. On the other hand, the Turkish government began organizing the local Kurdish tribes while collecting the Assyrians' weapons so they wouldn't be able to defend themselves under the pretense of preventing a British-led rebellion. That July, Hakkari's Turkish governor began inspecting the region's tribes in accordance with a government order. When some Assyrians came across him on August 7, they began shooting at his convoy. The government and 5 soldiers were injured and taken prisoner, while 4 of those with him were killed. The Assyrians planned to deliver the prisoners to the British, but released them after another Assyrian leader intervened. Upon learning of these events, the Turkish government labelled the incident as a rebellion and decided to use force to expel the unwanted returnees. On August 14, plans were made and the forced expulsion operation began on September the 11th, another very potent date. Armed Assyrians were to be pursued and destroyed, and the force gathered against these 8,000 returnees was over 40,000, including local Kurdish volunteers. The Assyrians could not put up a serious resistance since their population was limited and the majority of their fighting men were in military service with the British in Iraq. The unarmed civilians abandoned their villages, fleeing to the mountains. The British ordered the Assyrians not to return to Iraq and not to cross the border again, and the operation was terminated on October the 2nd. In Ataturk's opening speech to the Turkish Grand National Assembly that November, he referred to serious crimes committed by some Nestorian bandits, requiring some special measures. This act of ethnic cleansing is recorded in official Turkish history as the Nestorian Revolt, and is considered the first uprising against the Republic. That October, the League of Nations met to discuss the disputed border between Turkey and Iraq. Commissions appointed by them found that Turkish soldiers occupied villages and carried out forced deportation en masse of Hakkari's last Assyrians, during which they fell ill and were abandoned or died of starvation and cold. It blamed the soldiers for imposing very heavy punishments and carrying out acts of violence going as far as massacre, with Kurds being used to kill Christians. By September 1927, the entire frontier had been demarcated on the ground, and the Hakkari Assyrians were involuntarily locked out of their homeland by arguments in which they had no say at all. Now, between 1921 and 1925, most Hakkari Assyrians were resettled in villages across northern Iraq. Some of these were leased directly by the government, while others belonged to Arab or Kurdish landlords who had the right to evict them at any time, and many of them were located in unhealthy areas prone to disease. At the same time, some Assyrians were enlisted in the Iraq levies, a military force under British command which Iraqi nationalists viewed as proxies to destroy the new Iraqi Arab state. Britain granted independence to Iraq in 1932, and the mandate's end caused considerable unease among the Assyrians, who felt betrayed by the British. For them, any treaty with the Iraqis had to take into consideration their desire for autonomy. The Iraqis, however, felt that the Assyrians' demands were a conspiracy by the British to divide Iraq by agitating minorities. The new Assyrian Patriarch demanded an autonomous area within Iraq, seeking support from Britain and the League of Nations. His followers planned to resign from the Iraq levies, to regroup as a militia, and concentrate in the north, creating a de facto Assyrian enclave. In June 1933, the Patriarch was invited to Baghdad for negotiations with the government, but was detained there, and after refusing to relinquish his temporal authority, he was forced into exile in Cyprus on the 18th of August. On the 21st of July, some 600 Assyrians crossed into Syria in hope of receiving asylum from French mandate authorities. This was refused, and they were subsequently sent back on the 4th of August. While crossing the border, however, a clash erupted between them and an Iraqi army brigade. The Assyrians, convinced that they had been deliberately targeted, attacked the army barracks and were driven back into Syria. Even though all military activities had ceased, exaggerated stories of Assyrian atrocities and anti-Christian propaganda started to circulate. The Iraqi army moved north in order to crush the Assyrian revolt. Again, the Assyrian struggle for their rights is labeled a revolt, executing every Assyrian male they found, starting from the 8th of August. While these killings were taking place, nearby Kurdish and Arab tribes were encouraged to loot more than 60 Assyrian villages, and women and children were mostly allowed to take refuge in neighboring villages, but men were rounded up and handed over to the army, by whom they were shot. Some villages were completely burned down, and most of them were later resettled by Kurds. On the 8th and 9th of August, a military force arrived in the town of Semer, to which thousands of Assyrians had fled, in order to disarm the men. 2 days later, Iraqi soldiers in armored cars arrived and began to fire indiscriminately into the defenseless Assyrians. The campaign lasted until the 16th of August, but violent raids on Assyrians were reported up until the end of the month, during which a total of 3,000 Assyrian civilians were killed. The massacres and looting had a deep psychological impact on the Assyrians, and over 12,000 subsequently left for Syria, where they built new villages on the banks of the Khabur in the Jazeera region. Now, 4 years later, similar events were repeated in Syria. On the 9th of August 1937, Assyrians originally from Mardin, who had sought refuge in the town of Amuda after the Assyrian genocide, were massacred by Kurds backed by the Damascus government's Arab nationalist bloc, and their properties were destroyed. They had also been campaigning for recognition and rights, following French plans for withdrawal from the country. This led to the forced migration of over 6,000 Assyrians to the nearby towns of Qamishli and Al-Hasaka, and Amuda's eventual Kurdification. This event ended nearly a quarter century of violence and displacement that dislodged Assyrians from their homelands, psychologically impaired them, and curbed their aspirations for recognition and autonomy for generations to come. After nearly 7 decades, however, August again emerged as a month of tragedy for the Assyrians in Iraq, beginning with attacks on churches in major urban centers in 2004, following the American intervention that led to the removal of dictator Saddam Hussein. The culmination of this was the so-called Islamic State's invasion of Mosul in June a decade later, followed by the storming of the Nineveh Plain on August 7 and 8. Christians were given the option to either convert to Islam, pay a discriminative tax, leave, or be killed. And this came after Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki had announced a plan to create new provinces in disputed areas that were home to significant national minorities, among them the Nineveh Plain, where the Assyrians had been campaigning to establish an autonomous administration. About 150,000 Christians, mostly of Assyrian ethnicity, were displaced from Mosul and the Nineveh Plain as a result, and less than a third of them have returned since these areas were liberated in 2017. The majority have either settled in Iraq's Kurdish-ruled northern region or have left for the diaspora. Now for my conclusions. As we can gather from the cases presented of the forced migration of indigenous Christian Assyrians, These are a people whose aspirations have been and still are perceived as a threat by the nationalist and religious movements of their Muslim neighbours. It has largely been on this pretense that genocidal acts have been committed against them, largely with their closest neighbours, the Kurds, being used as proxies by Arab and Turkish nationalist masterminds in far-flung capital cities to actually carry out their dirty work. This was most certainly the case in the quarter-century period between 1914 and 1937, when the Assyrians were chased from Turkey to Iran and Iraq, then from Iraq to Syria, and their subsequent dispersal from rural towns to urban centres, where they could be controlled and assimilated. The Assyrians were often perceived as agents of foreign Christian elements, such as the Russians or the English or French Mandate powers, and role models for subsequent Kurdish secessionism. Moreover, the fact that they are transnational and native to the borderlands of Middle Eastern countries caused a paranoid desire for acts that would break up their demographic strength and geographic contiguity, but which ended up backfiring by causing greater Kurdish problems for Arab and Turkish nationalist hegemons. Thus, even though the Islamic State onslaught of 2014 was mainly portrayed as a Sunni Muslim religious crusade against Western and Iranian intervention in Iraq and Syria, we again observe the targeted weakening of Christians through forced antagonistic foreign through forced migration, due to their continued aspirations for self-rule and their identification with antagonistic foreign elements. Why most of these events have occurred around the first half of August, for me, is a mystery. But maybe it has something to do with the weather, which make these acts easier to perpetrate, or maybe the heat makes the attackers excessively agitated and violent. At any rate, let us hope that we can learn from the mistakes of the past in order to preserve and protect what little is left of this indigenous people, so that they can remain to live a dignified existence in their traditional homelands. And I thank you very much for your attention.